Okay, good evening, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for coming. My name is Ian Kane. I'm an associate professor of architecture here in the College of Architecture, Construction, and Planning. And welcome to tonight's installation of the Dean Speaker Series. I'm very pleased this evening to welcome my colleague, collaborator, and friend, Derek Hoeferlin. He is principal of Derek Hoeferlin Design, an award-winning trans-scalar architecture and urban design practice based in St. Louis, Missouri. He's also an associate professor at Washington University, where he's an award-winning educator who explores architecture, explores landscape, infrastructure, and urbanism. But before I offer you more details of Derek's work, I want to give you a little backstory, if you'll indulge me. Derek and I first met in 2005 at Washington University when we were both practitioners essentially trying to figure out how to transition from professional practice into full-time academia. I'm happy to say that we both succeeded in that. But this was an intense time for architects and urbanists. Many of you will remember that in late August of 2005, just as the new school year began, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, tragically killing almost 2,000 people, causing $125 billion of damage, and raising serious questions about the efficacy of urban planning, about the efficacy of urban policy, and certainly about urban design. How was it, many people wondered, that one of the great American cities had ended up underwater? And such questions resonated loudly at the time in the city of St. Louis. Remember that St. Louis and New Orleans share an ecological and a cultural DNA. They're both French colonies, both located on the Mississippi River, and both have suffered massive losses due to flooding over the years. And I think that these questions resonated also loudly for Derek, who had been a student at Tulane School of Architecture and had practiced for a number of years in New Orleans prior to going to Yale for graduate school. So what were the lessons of Katrina for architects and urban designers? And I asked this as a rhetorical question, really as a way to try to help frame Derek's work and help frame what I believe will be his lecture this evening. So the first lesson of Katrina for many of us was that in order for architects to reestablish an urban program, it was absolutely necessary for us to engage cities as ecological systems as well as formal systems. And at the time, this particular trajectory was already been advanced by architects like Charles Waldheim. Now, Charles Waldheim, some of you know him, he was an architect at the time living in Chicago, and had a strong connection to Washington University in the late 1990s. He would go on to institutionalize the trajectory of landscape urbanism at the University of Toronto and eventually at Harvard. But those ideas were in the air, so to speak, and were certainly influencing people like Derek early in his career. The second lesson of Katrina, I think, involved a re-examination of scale. In other words, how big should architects go in conceptualizing urban design solutions? Difficult to overstate the traumatic effect that these aerial images of New Orleans had on people, especially on architects. The city was underwater. And these images, I think, forced architects to consider the absurdity of obsessing about the proportions of streets and blocks and neighborhoods when, in fact, large-scale infrastructural decisions and policies made at the highest level of government, including national government, were impacting the existential state of entire cities. It was humbling. A third lesson of Katrina, and this is something that Derek and I had discussed in great detail, was the absolute necessity for architects to engage public policy, to move beyond the typical disciplinary boundaries of the profession. And again, the thought here is that meaningful urban form could only emerge within a fully articulated and critical political position. That was something that we talked about. So those are the early days and projects, and since then, Derek has gone on to contribute to and lead a number of successful and recognized urban design projects, both real and speculative, and I'll give you just a few samples. In 2007, he worked on the Unified New Orleans Plan for Post-Hurricane New Orleans with H3 Studio. 2012, he contributed to the Greater New Orleans Urban Water Plan. That project received an APA National Planning Award with Wagner and Ball Architects. 2015, there was a changing course competition. His team was one of 3 winners in this highly competitive national competition. 2017, he received first prize in designing resilience international open competition, and most recently in 2018, he led a team that was named as one of 3 finalists in the Shoto Greenway competition, and this proposal has just received a 2019 AIA New York Urban Design Honor Award, not a small feat. In conclusion, I think that Derek's career is a great example of understanding the importance of the time and place that you live in, of formulating a clear response to that time and place, and to putting your thoughts into action. Tonight, Derek Hoeferlin will describe current work that examines water-based design strategies across the Mississippi, the Mekong, and the Rhine River basins. The title of his lecture is Way Beyond Bigness, a Need for a Watershed Architecture. Please join me in welcoming Derek Hoeferlin.
All right, thanks Ian for that great introduction. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the architecture school, the faculty and staff, of course the students. Armando and Nicole have been very helpful through all this coordinating, and of course my colleague and close friend Ian Kane, who he mentioned we've known each other since 2005, and what he didn't mention, and I will show some of as well, that we've had some really successful and amazing collaborative efforts on with each other and others as well. So jumping into it, the title of this lecture, if it advances, let's see. That's a good start. Is it on pause or something? Here we go. I'll just set these mouse. So Way Beyond Bigness, the Need for a Watershed Architecture. It's going to be in 3 parts tonight. The first third of it, I'll give an overall kind of introduction to the themes that I'm doing with the research. The second part will go deep into the methodology, which is all in and of itself a 3-part methodology that consists of analyzing, synthesizing, and catalyzing work. And then I'll end with the project that Ian mentioned, the project in St. Louis, the design competition that was a pretty incredible effort from last year. I want to start with this quote. Some of you may be aware of the amazing environmental photographer Edward Bertensky, and it's water is the reason we can say its name. It's pretty kind of short and sweet. It's why we exist. As Ian mentioned, for context, 2 moments have led me to question my role as an architect in relation to larger contemporary issues of the built environment. The first one is the publishing of Small, Medium, Large, and Extra Large in October 1995, featuring Rem Koolhaas's manifesto, Bigness or the Problem of the Large. And the second one was the landfall of Hurricane Katrina just outside of New Orleans in August 2005. In Bigness, Rem Koolhaas specifically challenged architects, and one could argue by extension landscape architects, urban designers, planners, and other design disciplines to surrender to complex modes of technologies, to politics, and to economics. This was set within emerging issues of globalization in the 1990s, that is, emerging to the architecture discipline. Koolhaas charged, quote, "The makers of bigness are a team," a word not mentioned in the last 40 years of architectural polemic. 10 years later, Hurricane Katrina catapulted the fields of design into an unprecedented, human-altered natural disaster, and within such challenged designers to prove their relevance. Although still the costliest natural disaster in USA history, we would soon realize that Hurricane Katrina was not just a one-off, and one just only specific to the Gulf Coast of the United States, or other coastal contexts for that matter. Since Katrina in 2005, and especially since 2008, frequent extreme weather events and water-based catastrophes in the United States, both coastal and inland, have repeated over and over again. Couple this with the accelerating realities of the effects of climate change in the US and elsewhere, we can only assume more extremes will continue with intensities and do so relentlessly. Koolhaas makes only the slightest swipe to water and bigness when he referred back to his delirious New York retroactive manifesto stating, quote, "The architecture relates to the forces of the Großstadt, the city, like a surfer to the waves." Obviously, Katrina was almost all about water, and both are definitely what I define as watershed or tipping point events for the design disciplines. And to be clear, not just limited to the discipline of architecture. By extension, these calamities have challenged design discipline's roles in complicated community, political, and multi-scale post-disaster contexts. Both Bigness and Hurricane Katrina have challenged designers to step up, to engage, to get out of their bubbles, both academic and professional ones. But how to do so? Can the academic-professional divide truly remain intact to adequately address such challenges? I contend it cannot. Therefore, this is a dilemma that is way beyond bigness, or in other words, what we often refer to as a Gordian knot, or an impossible problem. But maybe there's a clue. Can water-based design optimistically engage such impossible problems, and in doing so, productively offer new possibilities? The following design research project prioritizes water as a transformative agent for design disciplines, and at multiple scales, what I define as way beyond bigness, the need for a watershed architecture. As designers, it is our responsibility to appreciate, to speculate, and to collaborate on the possibilities of how the engagement with water ultimately impacts and potentially prioritizes our design decisions. These global fundamentals must reinstate an understanding of the complicated built-in environments we and all other species share. These are ones we cannot continue to dominate with hard-line and static interventions, but rather ones we should begin to design with adaptive and dynamic negotiations. To do so, designers must become better aware of designers' transcalar relationships, spatially, temporally, and geopolitically. This is not just for design's sake, but also more importantly for design's multi-scaled integration of architecture, engineering, landscape, infrastructure, urbanism, policy, economy, ecology, hydrology, etc., and ultimately the larger distribution context of watersheds that all designs inhabit. In other words, the inevitable and hopefully smarter next step in the cause and effect networking of human-manipulated built environments. Way Beyond Bigness prioritizes two approaches. One, the understanding of the larger scale effects of watersheds for design decisions. More specifically, how can designing with water and infrastructure integrate best with the built environment? And two, the inevitable yet resilient need to adapt to contemporary tipping point watershed events in time. Way Beyond Bigness proposes a simple, adaptive framework that utilizes an integrative design research methodology, structured as appreciate and analyze, speculate and synthesize, collaborate and catalyze. Woven throughout these three parts, it attempts to realign watersheds and architecture across multiple scales, from the site to the river basin, disciplines from ecologists to economists, narratives from the hyperbolic to the realistic, and venues from academic to professional. So this necessary realignment I define as watershed architecture. Given our complex contemporary challenges, specifically in relation to water, current design research cannot be accomplished by one author, or by that matter, by one architect. Rather, it requires collaborations that oscillate inside and outside typical design disciplines definitions and that break down these professional and academic dichotomies. The body of work represents a selection of efforts, many of which are ongoing, that have been conducted with professional colleagues and faculty, research assistants, and students from Washington University in St. Louis, in addition to prior institutional collaborations with the University of Toronto, Tulane, and MIT, and unique efforts with people like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the barge industry, among others. Since my primary home teaching and practice reside in St. Louis, along with prior and continuing work in New Orleans, the work in this talk tonight begins, prioritizes, and ends in the Mississippi River Basin. But this work is critically understood comparatively with two other major river basins, the Mekong and the Rhine. I do hope tonight's talk offers a template for such a challenge, or at the very least serves as a platform to debate the merits of such work. So some definitions. Watershed. Way Beyond Bigness questions why a watershed's principal definition is an area or ridge of land that separates waters flowing to different rivers, basins, or seas. The scientist geographer John Wesley Powell contextualized watersheds further with his ubiquitously referenced view. Quote, that area of land, a bounded hydrological system within which all living things are inextricably linked by their common water course, and where, as humans settled, simple logic demanded that they become part of a community. Powell emphasizes a watershed's potential to prioritize a community's interaction, and I would argue manipulation within the hydrological boundary of a certain scaled watershed. In other words, what Shafakul Islam and Lawrence E. Susskind in their book Water Diplomacy, a Negotiated Approach to Managing Complex Water Networks, interpret as the coupling of the natural and the societal domains. But for designers, what skill sets can we contribute to better enable a watershed's integration with the realities of the built environment, many of which do not obey the logic of hydrological boundaries? And by extension, can a better appreciation for watersheds make us better designers? As I already mentioned, these realities include the need for designers to engage contested issues, not just including architecture, but also infrastructure, landscape, urbanism, regimes of control, species, societies, and climatic and or geopolitical influences, the real and the fake, all of which may reside within or outside the watershed. I like this quote here from Augusta Gold in a pretty known book, The First of Things is Water. But it's interesting that the word designer is nowhere in here. I'm not sure if you can read that. It's pixelated, but it's biologists, chemists, engineers, so etc. So where are the designers? What is our role? The alternate and possibly just as important definition for a watershed is an event or period marking a turning point in a situation in a course of action or a state of affairs. Definition not exactly about water per se, but one having to do with major jolts or minor glitches in what seem to be ordinary states of affairs. Think jolts like a hurricane or glitches like a tweet. Either have consequence, be them positive or negative, visible or invisible, immediate or distant, or what Malcolm Gladwell refers to as, quote, that magic moment and spreads like wildfire. Way beyond bigness questions why an architecture's principal definition is the, quote, practice of designing and constructing buildings. Although this disciplinary strength remains the priority for most practicing and aspiring architects, it also reinforces the discipline potentially operating in a silo and dangerously out of touch. Maybe a more pertinent question is, what really constitutes a building? Our friends at the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards, otherwise known as NCAR, elaborate for what licensed architects are responsible. Quote, licensed professionals trained in the art and science of design and construction of buildings and structures that primarily provide shelter. An architect will create the overall aesthetic and look of buildings and structures, but the design of a building involves far more than its appearance. Buildings must also be functional, safe, and economical, and must suit the specific needs of the people who use them. Most importantly, they must be built with the public's health, safety, and welfare in mind. This last sentence is crucial. Not only is it a legal mandate, one at least in the United States, it raises three important external influences: health, safety, and welfare. These are complexities that may be considered outside of the realm, or more specifically, enclosure of a building. Way Beyond Bigness argues that these can only be understood with a new appreciation for both watersheds and architecture. Water knows no boundaries, buildings tend to want boundaries. The alternate definition for architecture, the complexity or carefully designed structure of something. Architects, just let that sink in for a few seconds. Something. Granted, this is a ridiculously vague kind of definition, but the idea of something is quite provocative for the discipline of architecture. I guess it's considered hearsay to those that believe that architecture can only be practiced by a licensed architect, and as such that only an architect can design buildings. This is primarily for legal reasons, and many perceive this liberal use of the term as a threat to our discipline. But let's face it, most of the built environment is not even stamped by a licensed architect. So if we suspend what can be argued to be an archaic view of the discipline, architecture no longer is just about designing buildings. Rather, architecture is more encompassing and about designing complex, careful structures. And for the case of watershed architecture, the something is water. Again, the authors Islam and Susskind argue for a diplomatic approach to, quote, manage water networks, and contend that water problems are complex, are not easily knowable, and are usually unpredictable. and cannot be solved by reductionism or systems engineering. Rather, water resources might be more effectively managed if understood more about the interaction and feedback among components of the relevant natural, societal, and political systems. This liberation of unpredictability may be what holds the most potentiality for designers in relation to water. I'm not arguing for watershed architecture to be a substitute for what architecture already does so well, or a substitute for any design discipline for that matter. Rather, I'm arguing for it to be a flexible roadmap for various disciplines to better engage water-based design, and in doing so by adding one's own disciplinary strength, productively learn from other disciplines. Simple as that. So, Way Beyond Bigness aspires for opportunity, not crisis, proactive, not reactive, downstream and upstream, and pragmatism and optimism. Pessimistically, our collective 21st century crisis in regards to the built environment is climate change, and more specifically in relation to water-based disasters. If we couple these challenges with our globally failing physical and social infrastructure, the future is indeed grim. Optimistically, what if we disregard our archaic, reactive, crises-driven approaches and reorient to accommodate climate change, and in doing so, to adapt with sea level rise, to transform waste into resources, to live with the water, and so forth? What if watersheds and architecture combine as a new and proactive design framework, potentially, maybe even dangerously, as a new discipline, one that prioritizes contemporary water opportunities and tipping points in time that are way beyond our historically conventional understandings of such? Proactive, not reactive. Life and society depend upon water. We often fail to appreciate that the molecular connection is so essential. Recent human-altered water-based catastrophes in the USA alone, such as hurricanes, floods, droughts, dam failures, oil spills, contaminations, and wildfires, place front and center that our technological supremacy over water can have unintended and oftentimes disastrous effects. We are repetitively reactive rather than positively proactive. The status quo is economically, environmentally, and socially unacceptable. Additionally, water may be the most politicized commodity on Earth. But as the landscape architect professor, my friend Jane Wolfe, once told me, water is apolitical. In other words, water ultimately flows where water wants to flow. Water always wins. Take the New Orleans region as an example. The city and its surrounding Louisiana Delta have become ground zero for all such things, human-made water disasters, such as hurricanes and oil spills and even droughts. However, it is important that New Orleans not alone, or Galveston, Houston, or South Texas for that matter. Water is a continental issue, and of course, water is a global issue. Water, if not already so, will become the global crisis. But there is the alternate way. We need to anticipate, design as foresight, rather than wait, design as hindsight. Downstream and upstream. In the face of these uncertain issues of climate change, extreme weather events, sea level rise, water scarcities, and population fluctuations that are both rapidly increasing and decreasing, significant attention has been brought to the comparative studies of deltas and their urbanized regions. Known as delta urbanisms, these water-rich regions arguably are the economic lifeblood of most nations' economies. However, watershed architecture argues it is crucial to take an even bigger step back and understand deltas and their urbanisms not just within and compared among themselves, but also within their larger cause and effect distribution context of watersheds, or more technically, river basins. Upstream is the starting point, not downstream in the delta. I argue for shifting priorities upstream. Finally, it's about pragmatism and optimism. Since I'm an optimist architect, I hope everyone in this room is, I truly believe that deltas, their urbanisms, and their much larger scale distributed river basin scale and continental context must be the models for what my design collaborator and friend Ian Kane and I define as 21st and 22nd century hydroregions. Actually, it is rather pragmatic, that it's instead of a foolhardy idealistic approach. In other words, hydroregions, up and down entire river basins, must get their fundamentals straight. These fundamentals first begin with a return to basics, a foundational understanding that water is the primary component of the actual ground that is occupied. This is priority number one for architects. I hope you're able to read some of these slides. They look a little washed out, but all these ones you've been seeing have been obviously a lot of collaborative efforts, and a few of them you've just seen in the recent ones are of work I've done with Ian for a number of years. So it's part one of the talk. I'll stop reading at this point. So into the methodology, as I mentioned, the first part is appreciate and analyze the need for transboundary understandings. It's unfortunate, there's supposed to be some other images here. This is not intentional, but maybe it is, because this is the upstream part of the Mekong River Basin, and this is the downstream part. So right now it's been kind of censored. So, but what you have just seen, other than a lot of the design drawings and the proposals, most of all the photographs that you've seen have been taken by myself. And I don't mean that just kind of that they're good photographs, but I've had a genuine interest over the last 15 years to really make it to not just the Mississippi River Basin, but also, as Ian mentioned, the Mekong and the Rhine. So some of these slides you'll see here are preliminary layouts for a book that I'm currently working on that's supposed to be finished some point later this year, hopefully sooner than later, but we know how those go. So why the Mississippi, the Mekong, and the Rhine, other than personal reasons? The personal answer is I live in the Mississippi. I really love Southeast Asia, and I have a lot of Dutch friends. So those are kind of the personal reasons I live at those three. But the maybe borderline, overly simplistic, naive reasons are, you could argue that the Mississippi is kind of in a stagnating state, a 20th century version of development. The Mekong is rapidly developing, if any of you are aware, and that's what kind of a lot of the focus of my research is looking at large-scale infrastructure, specifically dams along these rivers. The Mekong is building huge dams up and down the whole system, mostly the upper part. And arguably the Rhine, given the structure of its countries in the Netherlands and Germany, France, and Switzerland, is adapting. They actually have transboundary negotiations between them. So what's really important in this work, and you're going to see kind of a series of analytical diagrams, is the first part, is you first start with who manages these things. So this is something that Ian and I are interested in terms of kind of understanding the policy and politics implications of this type of work. So what I'm developing here, and these are with research assistants at Washington University, former students, are starting to do a series of what intentionally are meant to be flow charts that kind of untangle the management structure of each river basin. And maybe that's retangling how complicated it really is. It's almost impossible to decipher, but these is really showing how everything, for instance, in the Mississippi, ends up being kind of ordered, mandated by U.S. Congress, for instance. The Mekong River Commission, without going into too much detail, is a different kind of non-governmental transboundary body that's trying to help different countries plan in a more adaptive way across it, and that's the Mekong River Commission, but also funded heavily by countries outside of Asia, as well as quite a robust effort of NGOs. And then in the Rhine, which answers kind of ultimately up to the EU, and who knows what the future of that structure will be. But there's two main bodies. One is representing the navigation and kind of economic interests of the Rhine, and the other one is the environmental interests. So each one of these three I've been meeting with on research trips, documentary trips, and it's quite fascinating to see how they take their different approaches. Some of the other information that I've been diagramming is just simple metrics that compares these three different basins. So as you can see, the Mississippi is the largest. You can fit quite a few Rhines within the Mississippi and a few Mekongs within that. Understanding the territories and the tributaries within the river basin, because again, the Mississippi River Basin is not just the Mississippi River, it's a whole series of tributaries that make up that main stem, but also the political kind of understanding of all the different states and the different jurisdictions of the Corps of Engineers, for instance. And for the Rhine, or for the Mekong, excuse me, and then for the Rhine. Oops. Also important is trying to map and understand the population densities of each one of these, which is quite interesting. These numbers I think are close. It used to be a little more, I thought, but the population's relatively similar, almost the same, but the geographical area, for instance, is radically different. So the Mississippi River Basin, what I'm going to show you, and hopefully it's relatively clear, I'm studying these three, and these are pretty simple drawings, actually. It's gone through quite a lot of different iterations over the number of years, whether it's professionally or through research or with studios. But I find the more and more you kind of dumb the drawings down with such complex issues, just simple plans, simple sections, the more legible the information gets. And it's a bigger question of who's the audience for this information, but that's a whole other can of worms. So I'm looking at right now what these layouts are showing, coupling different scales of studying the river basin along with field documentation photographs that relate to those scales. So I'm looking at 3 sub-basins within the Mississippi River Basin, and these red lines are all the dams along the rivers, as long as, which you can't really see here, is all the levees along the Mississippi, of course, which is what is so important about how it's controlled. The next scale in is the sub-basin. So within the Mississippi River Basin, there's 6 or so sub-basins, and a very important one is the Missouri River sub-basin. So this is up at the headwaters. That first slide I showed at the very beginning was up close to the headwaters of the Missouri River with these big dams that make their way all the way down, ultimately to St. Louis. The next scale is what I'm defining as a region scale. And just like anything, how do you define a region, right? In this case, it's from dam to dam. And then what is created within those dams is huge reservoirs. And in the Missouri Basin's case, those huge reservoirs mostly go through Native American reservations, such as Standing Rock. So when you start to hear things about the Dakota Access Pipeline and the protests that are going through Standing Rock Native American tribal lands, it unearths a deep history of those lands being flooded by the dams that were constructed in the 1960s, right? And the final scale, which is the dam scale. Has anyone visited the Missouri dams, been to any of these things? They're unbelievable, they're huge. Some of the largest earthen dams, or at least they were in the world. And that's what this is showing. This is an earthen dam. They're comprised of spillways, hydropower plants, and other legs. But really it's about, so what these photo compositions are showing, the different dams that I've been to. So dams, hydropower plants, reservoirs, spillways, which are now in operation if anyone's been following the news with the floods in the Missouri River, extractions. This landscape is heavily contested for things like the Bakken oil shale for natural gas extractions, which again are very close or on tribal lands, which impact the reservations and then create inundations. So these diagrams, so it starts to get more into showing more analytical axonometrics of how these dams are constructed, the sizes of them, and the reservoirs that they create. And not to get too deep into it, but one of the main reasons these dams exist is to create huge hydropower to export throughout these states in the northern plains. It's quite a phenomenal effort that was done originally from FDR and the WPA projects, but all the way through the 1960s. This article just came out a couple days ago in the New York Times, right? There's massive flooding happening right now in Nebraska. This is one of the spillways I went to. This is not my photograph. That these were not designed, first of all, they weren't designed for ecological considerations back when they were first made, but now they weren't designed to handle such huge extreme weather events. So it's quite a complex condition. Study zone number 2 is the upper Mississippi Basin, which is closer to me. So here's St. Louis. It's a whole series, 27 or so locks and dams. And the dams here for different reasons. It's to get barge traffic up and down the river to convey predominantly agricultural products and petrochemicals. And again, these are some of the drawings that explain the navigation structures that allow this barge industry to exist. And the final zone, and these are just drawings and processes down at the lower Mississippi in South Louisiana. Quickly, doing the same for the Mekong River Basin. This is a very different type of length of river, but not very dissimilar to what's has happened in the Mississippi Basin. Here's China up here, down through Laos, Vietnam and Cambodia and Thailand as well. And these are all dams that are either under construction or planned to be constructed. Huge dams, 2 and 3 times the size of Hoover Dam, multiplied by many. And that's what this drawing shows here. So here you can start to see the combination. I showed some slides in that slideshow showing exaggerated sections of this cascading series of dams where they're creating these reservoirs for water supply and hydropower in China. But the impact of these dams that have on downstream are really intense. The lack of sediment that doesn't make its way down, the ecological effects that happen all the way down in the delta. So these drawings are meant to try to unpack those different causes and effects. Moving down further into Laos, where Laos is currently constructing this series of these dams. They're mostly funded by outside governments, such as Thailand or China or even Europe. And Laos's goal is to be the battery of Southeast Asia. So they want to export the power and get money for it, right? It's a totally crazy situation that's happening, but it's going to incentivize probably huge development. This is the Jayaburi Dam, which I was fortunate to visit this past January. I had to be hosted by a couple government officials. Again, when you're in the Mekong, you're dealing with a very different structure of government that's mostly communist totalitarian regimes that are running these countries. So getting access to these can be, let's say I think I had to bribe a couple people to get there. But this is the photograph I was allowed to take of the dam under construction. So this is the first main stem dam of the Mekong that's being constructed in Laos. There's several that's been built in China, I already said. And this is one of the reservoirs we created. So I showed that slide that said this is not natural, right? This is not a natural condition. Just a year ago, this was a much narrower throat of a river. There were communities here. They've been flooded out. In Laos's case, they're actually moving them and working with them to move them to other locations, but it's a very controversial situation. And then finally, the Rhine. This is a photograph in the port of Rotterdam. And I won't go into those right now. Those drawings are in process. The second portion is speculate and synthesize. Ian mentioned that we've collaborated quite often. This is one project that we worked on 4 years ago, called the Continental Compact, Eastward Migration in a New World. I think that was Ian's title, the parentheses. But Ornication for hydro regions in the Mississippi River Basin. And my apologies if these are a little bit hard to read, but this drawing up here is one we did which maps the forecasted, and some of you have probably heard Ian talk about this, the forecasted mega regions for 2050. So you can see Chicagoland up here, Boswash, San Francisco down to San Diego, what have you. But from a New York Times article that was written about it, and if you dig deep into kind of the Urban Land Institute metrics, the one word that wasn't, I don't think, mentioned or barely mentioned as a defining parameter for mega regions of the future was water, which sounds somewhat shocking given all the events we're dealing with. So what Ian and I did, and I won't go into the whole competition, but we redrew the hydro regions 2050. So it's a very kind of diagrammatic, speculative idea, and you can start to see if you start to look at places like St. Louis or New Orleans or South Texas, even the Gulf of California, which no longer, or Colorado River, that no longer exists because the water has been transferred to Southern California. That's where the water is going to be, right? The water might not be the best quality water, but it's going to be there, right? And it's an asset to be able to be managed. A project I worked on, speculative idea of a watershed architecture, from the big dams, which I mentioned in the Missouri River, to the Bird's Foot, which is in South Louisiana. That's where the Mississippi River goes out to the Gulf because it looks like a bird's foot. Transforming the nutrients, the sediments, and the industries in the Mississippi River Basin. This diagram up here, very simple. The flow, the majority of the flow of the Mississippi comes from the Ohio River the majority of sediment, the silt that's in the river, the stuff that makes things really grow, what makes wetlands and all that grow over time, makes deltas, comes from the Missouri. And then when they join south of St. Louis, that's when it becomes the mighty Mississippi River. So there are two, we talked about it with Ian's students today, it's like how do you kind of get your head around these large-scale issues without trying to do, of course, everything? Well, in my case, it's like, for me, those are the two most important things that drive the development ecologically of the Mississippi River. It's mud and flow, right? But when we talk about water quality, huge, big agricultural practices that look like these, this is up in Illinois or Iowa, have massive runoff from the fertilizers, high nitrogen concentration, sometimes phosphorus from things like cows going to the bathroom. And that creates really intense nutrient overloads in the Mississippi. You couple that with these massive dams that have been built, and that holds the sediment there. So it's a big problem for the Corps of Engineers. It's not just a problem for the Delta. They don't know how to get that silt out. It was never designed to how to get it out of there. So that silt is supposed to make all of its way down a 3,500-mile journey down to the Delta to flood, to deposit that sediment so the wetlands can grow, right? So you start to see this interaction that's decoupled. So this is a diagram that shows how much sediment used to be in the Mississippi and how much there currently is getting down, so you have a deficit. Finally, if you expedite those flows with leveeing the whole thing, the water goes faster and higher, and it just shoots out as fast as possible out into the Gulf of Mexico, which creates a phenomenon called the dead zone. Some of you may have heard of the dead zone. So we're operating within this 20th century industry context. And what this drawing shows here, and I want to be clear, you've seen a series of these diagrams already. You've already seen this one. This idea of a toolkit that Ian and I started to get interested in about a decade ago, 2009, when we did this Rising Tides competition looking at San Francisco Bay. You saw some of those slides there. And we started to come up with this new idea for redrawing in a systems-based way, for instance, the watershed. So this is me redrawing the Mississippi River Basin. It's starting to show how you can transform different wastes, like nitrogen and sediment and pollution, into resources. Can't really read this drawing, but it's a globe projection. It shows the Missouri, so looking downriver, the Missouri River, the Mississippi, the Ohio, and down to the Delta. And what you can start, when you start to get into this stuff, and research is going on in this, is like you can take things like high nitrogen and make algae, right? What do you do with algae? You can turn it into algae fuel, right? So what all this is starting to say is you can make algae, you can distribute sediment, you can start to rethink how you come up with a new industrial complex for the 21st century. It's not saying this is going back to environmental natural wonder. That will never happen, especially in the United States. It's saying we have to rethink how we come up with this kind of industrial apparatus. Kind of pixelated, but then you start to say, well, there's different sites where these things could happen. You can have transport sites, farming sites, refined sites, filter sites, and restore sites. And each one of these is in a sub-basin. So as you make your way down the Mississippi, different things will happen and they'll coordinate with each other as you go down. And this is kind of an example of how you can take the algae, the nutrients, turn it into, put it on barges, refine it, and power. So this is somewhat speculative, somewhat real. It's very expensive. Don't get me wrong, because there isn't the industrial kind of necessity for it, or the economic necessity, because everything's run predominantly by oil and gas still. But there are people, I want to say there's people that are out there trying to really do this stuff. Like this is Brett. He's a farmer in Illinois who's being squeezed out by big agriculture. Here we are with my students, and Brett, and then Chuck Tiling, who's a large river ecologist for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. These two guys are trying to get their heads together to figure out how to do things with nutrients, do things with sediment. It's way beyond my kind of understanding. I mean, these are real deal ecologists and farmers, but they're deeply concerned about those issues I was just talking about. They're on the ground people, so this is where I'm starting to transition into the kind of engagement section of this work. And again, I just want to say, as architects, we have to go out on a limb and make these kind of bombastic ideas. And then I tell Chuck, I'm like, hey Chuck, I'm designing this crazy stuff. And Chuck says, that's really cool, let's do it, right? And I said, wait a minute, the guy from the Corps of Engineers just said he's interested in this speculative way of thinking. And at that point, it's like, okay, a designer's coming to this conversation, an ecologist is coming to this conversation, and he says, let's go meet this really great farmer who's deeply concerned about these issues, right? This is Chuck showing one of his restoration sites where the Mississippi is allowed to flood. It deposits that sediment. They're growing native species and other alternate crops that are trying to sequester the nutrients in the sediment. Again, I know we're getting way out of the bounds of architecture, but it's really interesting to start to think about the physicality of the landscape and how it can further be transformed in the future. I'm not going to go into depth of this given time, but this is a proposal that I did a couple of years ago. Ian mentioned it for the Mekong River Basin. So a similar speculative transboundary proposal from the third pole, which is the Tibetan Plateau, that's where all the glaciers are, to the Nine Dragons, that's the name of the Mekong Delta, keeping the water, the people, and the power within the Mekong River Basin. We earned it in the international design competition, and we were fortunate to win it. I think it shows the merits of this type of kind of drawing and proposals that can win an architecture and design competition. But backing up a lot of those drawings, again, is this kind of deep research into understanding all the different dams and their powers, how much they're costing, how many people are they displacing, what are they doing in different parts. But again, similar to the other projects we talked about, they proposed this idea of a toolkit. It's all right. Yeah, good. All right. Let's just go back. It's probably because it's a ridiculously huge PDF, right? Or forget that drawing. We'll go into the next one. But what these are doing is these toolkit things. It's like, okay, this is one of the threats. There's 6 threats and 6 adaptations that we defined. This is the 6th one, maybe the most important one, is exported power. This is a photograph I took in Bangkok a number of years ago. So literally these dams and thousands of miles away are exporting power to places like Bangkok, Hong Kong, all over, right? To incentivize urbanization, right? Which is a sustainable idea. For whom, right? Is it sustainable for places like Laos and Cambodia, the poor countries? It's a whole bigger question. So anyway, exported power, and what this one proposes is, and this is a conversation I had with the Mekong River Commission when I met with them, and they're very interested in this. Like, how do you start to, over time, vocalize the power? Granted, it's going to be exported for a while, but in time, how do you develop mechanisms to work with the communities to localize some of that power, or even propose alternate power sources such as solar, etc. This one I haven't figured out yet, but I better do fast because the book's due soon. But so this is for the Rhine, from the Rhine Quell, which is the source, to the Leo Hollandicus, which is a famous saying for the Netherlands. The backbone of the Netherlands is the backbone of the lion. There's no lions in Holland, but that's their national motto. So question mark, question mark. But I've started it similar on that kind of idea. Third part, collaborate and catalyze, the need for transboundary engagement, workshops, advocacies, exposures, interventions. And I'll go through these quickly. This was a workshop that I did at Washington University in St. Louis with John Holes, the chair of urban design program there, collaborating with my existing network of Dutch colleagues did this one specifically, the Royal Netherlands Embassy in Washington, D.C. So they funded the workshop, which was quite amazing. I've been working with them in New Orleans for a number of years. This is not a typo. It's the Native American name for Mississippi, which means Great River. So Mississippi is the word that we translated into the word Mississippi. What we were looking at was on the heels, and these are not the right ones. This is 2013, but it shows that these frequent high and low water events are happening on the Mississippi. There was a huge flood in 2011. And right after that, in 2012, there was a record drought in the St. Louis region. So back to back, we're having these ridiculously intense extremes. And then in 2013, we had another flood. And this is the low, and a few weeks later, that it's dropped. So we're operating in this kind of how does a built environment work within these intense events. This is a picture of the workshop, which shows the kind of insanity of bringing all these different groups together. So there's Steven Swavers from a really great landscape architecture firm in The Hague in the Netherlands, to all these other different disciplines, including the Corps of Engineers. And it's not only is it just really important to get stakeholders and community members involved, it's really important, especially in Mississippi, to get the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on board, and they are. They're very interested in these issues. Another missing drawing, but real quick, what we developed in that workshop was this idea of scenarios. You may have heard of this, but you just don't propose one idea, propose multiple ideas. So these are 3 different ideas that are looking at everything from the status quo of agricultural practices, how does that relate to these floods and droughts within the Mississippi around St. Louis, to just kind of making it stronger and better, bigger levees, bigger protection, bigger investment, to radical ideas of paradigm change, rethinking agricultural practices. And this is, again, this is where Brett is operating, my farmer friend. He's trying to figure out these different methods of future agriculture and how that comes right up against urbanized regions such as St. Louis. And this is one of the drawings we generated. This is all freehand colored pencil sketches. This is Robert de Koning, another great landscape architect from the Netherlands. This was a studio project that I worked on for a number of years at Washington University and University of Toronto called Gutter to Gulf. This is where we were advocating for integrated water management strategy in the city of New Orleans. We weren't just looking at the extraordinary events of Hurricane Katrina, but also the everyday. This is just a normal heavy rainfall in the city of New Orleans, which floods pretty quickly. This is what a drainage culvert looks like in the morning. After a heavy rain, it quickly fills up. Water is out of sight, not of mind. You never see it, rarely see it. It's hidden underneath the street in giant culverts. Is that my time warning? No, it's probably. And then this is some of the models. So what we make with the students is, this is an 1.5 inch thick piece of acrylic that we milled to show the topography, both the hydrology of the city and the hydraulics, the pipes and the pumps, how water moves through it. And those become tools that are used in public events, whether they're exhibition openings or with the communities, or in this case, they're being used in public schools within New Orleans to teach children about where they live. And of course, we make design proposals at different scales. So these are some of the student projects from the scale of the block and the lot all the way up to the city. There's a website that's still live. I mean, this has been going on for a number of years now, almost 10 years, Gutter to Gulf, that explains. And that really helped advocate for the project that Ian talked about, the Greater New Orleans Water Plan, which is now getting implemented in the city. Kind of a different project in St. Louis that I've been working on. These are drawings I've been doing with my students. The Public Lab River Rat Pack, kind of a strange name. This is one of our flood walls in St. Louis. This is not down in Louisiana, this is upriver. These are some of the photographs we were taking. In this case, we blow up big giant red balloons and fly them up 1,000 feet into the air and take aerial photographs. Don't ask me why we just don't use drones, that's a whole other question. But this is a flood in 2016, so this is the city, and there's the water, which is like 3 feet higher than that. And the problem, one of the big problems when the river gets this high, it gets so high that the sewage treatment plants shut down. So this is us standing there, this is all raw sewage coming into the city, leaking through the flood walls, right? And these are the balloons that we blow up. It takes a group effort, that's the real reason one person can fly a drone. It takes multiple people to commandeer a 5.5-foot balloon and drive it through the city. How do you get it? But I just want to show, this is a photograph we took 6 weeks actually later. This is low water level, and 6 weeks earlier, oops, there was that water, right? So you can see how dramatic the change is. We get some pretty interesting photographs, aerial. This is the Lockton Dam, just north of St. Louis. It's a project I just did. It's real short and sweet, but an art installation I was asked to contribute to. It marks the highest flood level, 1993, in St. Louis in 1973, which is the number 2. This actually didn't happen here, but this is in Granite City, Illinois. The flood wall is just a few miles away. It kind of marks what if the flood wall failed. A little bit terrifying. But it's quite beautiful too, because it has a human scale to it, like you exist within that 8-foot dimension. And it becomes architectural as well. And this is the project that I'm working on this year, where, long story short, it's helped being funded by crazy group out of Germany. This is a barge the Corps of Engineers has. My goal is to do an exhibition on a barge to actually get people on it, on the river. So finally, I know we're running a little late on time, but I want to end on this project, and I'll go to it relatively quickly, but this was a design competition Ian mentioned, sponsored by Great Rivers Greenway, which in St. Louis is the regional kind of pseudo-governmental agency for the Greenway Trail Network, bike and kind of recreation network through St. Louis is partially public and private funded, typical thing that's happening in a lot of American cities. They held a design competition called the Shoto Greenway Competition. It's really overexposed, but the competition, here's the Mississippi River, here's downtown St. Louis, there's the arch. The idea put for the competition is how do you connect Washington University and Forest Park, which is our central park, through the central part of the city to the arch and the river, right? And the whole central part of the city, rightfully so, is being redeveloped, heavy investment, Washington University, St. Louis University, bioinnovation. But it immediately brings up the question, who is this for, right? Who is this central redevelopment spine really built for in terms of the larger context of St. Louis? And I'm sure a lot of you know it's a complicated city that I live in, Rust Belt, de-industrial. We do exist in a post-Ferguson world there, so it's complicated that I won't get into. Oh, that's a better version. There you go. So this was our proposal, plus STL, growing an urban mosaic. I want to show you this down here. The main three team leads were myself, Object Territories, two former classmates of mine from Yale that operate between Brooklyn and Hong Kong, and Tom Leader's Studio Landscape Architects is out of Berkeley. So we were leading this project with a whole series of consultants and local community activists via multiple continents. So Hong Kong, Berkeley, here, St. Louis, wherever. It was a crazy effort, but it was a lot of fun, very intense. And there's our team, which is ridiculously big. But these competitions, which we can get into a whole other conversation about predatory design competitions and intellectual capital and all that, demand such a multidisciplinary horizontal structure if we're really going to get into social, environmental, equitable, justice issues as it relates to design in cities like St. Louis. So we just didn't have designers, which were the three of us. We also had cultural community and advocacy, which included arts as well, and local community members, social workers. Jason Purnell, if any of you have heard, is an amazing social worker up in St. Louis. Economics and land use, and engineering and environment, of course. But within that, this is a timeline that shows, kind of, you can't read it, the complexity of St. Louis. This is our population peak, and then 1950 on, right? And then the suburbs have been going up. So within that, you're operating in speculative futures in and of itself in terms of development, and then deindustrialized areas. So this is the terminus of the Greenway. This is where I was doing those balloon photographs. This is what a lot of the center of St. Louis looks like right now, right? And this is very different right now. This is being redeveloped into a new district. But a very difficult history, one that Ian knows well, is we tore out that whole midsection of the city. You can't see it, but the arch is under construction right here. It's called Mill Creek Valley. These used to be neighborhoods, right? Urban renewal in the 1950s and 60s. Cleared out Mill Creek Valley to create massive highways, right? So our approach was intentionally inclusive, equitably prosperous, purposefully connected, culturally meaningful, common ground for St. Louisans now into the future. This is one of my very early sketches that showed, okay, we understand this is this, but we got to start reaching north and south. Some of you in the room from St. Louis have been there and know that there's a huge divide between North and South City. This is North St. Louis up here and South St. Louis. So how do you get both to that area? We immediately knew that. We knew in the long term, long beyond the competition, you're going to have intense community engagement efforts to developing committees, ecological loops, equitable extensions, and economic assets. So not only do we just go from Forest Park to the Arch, we also connect major important parks in South City to ones in North City via this plus symbol. and then reach out even further into the neighborhoods of North St. Louis and further into the neighborhoods of South St. Louis, and you start to get this cruciform shape that is almost equal east and west as it is north and south. These are all existing economic assets. So already within this is a whole confetti and mosaic of really amazing things that are in St. Louis. They're just islands, they're separated. How do you connect them? Hopefully something like a Greenway network. And then there's the diagram. This was our final plan that the landscape architects Tom Leader studio drew that showed it knitting. We wanted to show the kind of graininess of it, engaging the existing context. All the neighborhoods, it's a city, it's an amazing city of neighborhoods. All cities, any city that has great neighborhoods is great, right? But St. Louis is really special with all its north and south neighborhoods. And then how does our new proposal relate to the existing network that's already being constructed or will be constructed? So you can see that most of the city is being covered by that. This is where we maybe started to get a little out of control and the jury got freaked out, but we said, well, why stop there, right? I'm the river guy, so let's go to Mississippi. You know, and it actually makes sense. These things all connect back, right? That the city could really kind of connect back in many different ways, which is what this hopefully shows. These are all these, the blue things are not proposals. They're all existing trails that have already been built throughout the region. And that's what it would look like at night and day. So quickly, I'll end with this. I'm going to walk you through a few of the projects that show before and afters. So that just it's a selection of them, 4 through the east-west and 2 important ones in north-south. The first one is, and this is something that was very important from the competition jury and the project partners. And when I mean project partners, it's like the money. Washington University is like, all right, you need to design us a better connection from our campus to Forest Park. So this is the campus over here. It's where the architecture school is. This is Forest Park. A very difficult, dangerous intersection. People literally get hit on their bikes. So we thought, well, let's be really ambitious and say, well, if you're going to connect, decouple it, right? Build a much more open public area to get you through and under and back over to the campus, program it, have art installations, not just high-profile artists, but ones that really kind of engage different contexts within the city. The next one is in that Mill Creek Valley area where this whole spaghetti mess of highways are coming through, where St. Louis University is. So back to this photograph. It's what it looks like right now. And we worked with our traffic engineers to come up with forecasts of these are redundant car ramps. I mean, it's a mess. There's just ramps everywhere for cars. And we said, well, we could start to transform some of those, not eliminate them, but reconfigure them to be bike and pedestrian friendly, but also start to unearth, literally unearth some of the history that's been erased and hidden, and propose something like an archaeological cultural institute. And community events can be part of that. That photograph I already showed you. This is the development which is happening right now. That we would propose something that would work at different speeds. So that highway, you would have billboards could be transformed into public art pieces. There are ecological places for things like bald eagles, maybe, but also connecting through. And that this project's happening not in our way, but at least it's happening. Downtown, next to where the greatest baseball team plays, the Cardinals, and a monument to leaving the city exists. There's this huge parking lot. Great Rivers Greenway actually owns a good chunk of this, and they want to turn this into something, to get rid of parking over time. So this is where we hit hard on the ecological aspect. Our team of the 4 that were finalists really said this is where the creek used to go through, so let's make this a biodiversity and birding park right in the center of the city. So it goes from something like that to that in the summer and that in the winter. And we have a series of axons that explain the connection between the central corridor across these places, understanding the hydrology of the city, getting back to kind of the overall premise of this talk. How do you manage that water and convey it and make it part of the design? So hopefully you could have things like places like this, and at night be welcoming for kids to see things like bats and coyotes that make their way into the city because they want to come into the city. But finally, and maybe the most kind of, I don't want to say mundane, but non-designed thing that's so important are these north and south city parks that are very underutilized and underfunded, right? So St. Louis is really good at doing something it does phase one really well, right? It has a real difficulty with following through. So here's the arch back here. This is Marquette Park, working, and one of our team members represents these neighborhoods, Dutchtown neighborhood, and asking the community what are the different simple modifications that need to happen within this area to make it a much more accessible and welcoming park. So Compton Avenue goes straight through it. It's a really important north-south artery. You can go from this. Everyone's on the same page that dedicated bike lanes, no matter how much they cost, are a necessity in the future, especially when you integrate them into public functions, community functions such as these. And then in North City, just real quick, and this isn't an actual, well, it is a project, but this is Vanderbilt Avenue, which is a really important north-south connection with its dedicated bike lanes. But then, you know, stuff like this, the informal things, which are really important in design and urbanism, that you transform kind of the understanding of the street, the occupation, getting people from different parts of the city to understand these great neighborhoods. And again, that's the final shape. And my apologies for maybe going too long, but that's my talk. I really appreciate you having me here. Any questions, I'd be happy to take. Thanks.